And
Yeah, let me know.
okay,
Okay,
we should
thank you.
be good to go.
All right, thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody, and sorry for that little bit of a delay. And this will be the agenda for the Committee of the Whole meeting of Monday, February 28th at 2022. And at this time, we acknowledge with gratitude that we live and work in the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish Nation, whose people have been stewards of these lands and waters surrounding the Qualaquam Bowen Island for millennia. First item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. Does anybody, any changes there? Okay, nobody's got anything. I will approve the agenda by consensus. And public comments. Anybody out there home?
I have no one registered.
All right, and then we'll go right through to hazardous areas, DPA and site alteration. Proposed hazardous areas development permit areas. Daniel Martin, Manager of Planning and Development. Hi, Daniel, and go ahead.
Can't hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Council. So I have on the agenda tonight two reports that sort of tie into each other, and there's a third report that's the public consultation report that's an appendix to the that first report. So I have two separate presentations to go through. So one is on the hazardous areas development permit area and incorporates some of that public consultation information as well. And the second one is specific to site alteration bylaw. So I'm happy to go through maybe the first presentation first for hazardous areas to have some discussion and then move on to site alteration bylaw, if that works for council.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so by way of background, staff presented to council in July of 2021 a staff report looking at draft findings for hazardous areas development permit area, and council at that point referred the report to a number of advisory committees, to a public open house, and to a future committee of the whole meeting, which is where we are today. So I'll go through now just the results from the various committees. So the APC, we went in November. They had some comments for council on what to consider in terms of, in particular, looking at what existing hazards are already being regulated. Yeah, the Emergency Program Executive Committee met in September, and they said generally they support measures that increase public safety and improve emergency response, so including the proposed hazardous areas development permit. The Environment and Climate Action Committee had comments that I haven't included in this report, but their motion was that they support the proposed hazardous areas development permit area. The Parks, Trails, Greenways Advisory Committee as well, if you look in the report, had a meeting where they provided a number of very detailed and useful comments, but the motion that they passed is they support additional protection and regulation of development of hazardous areas, particularly those that protect the parks, trails, greenways, and beaches, and given the extreme weather events and their likely more frequent events in future due to climate change. So then in terms of public outreach, we held an open house, which ended up looking different because of trying to cope to various public health orders. So we had an open house for the week of December 6th, which was a drop-in event. We held 2 Zoom open houses, and then we did an online survey that was open in December and January. And we received 72 responses to the survey and 8 letters, and had a number of drop-ins to the open house for discussion. And so the report has a more detailed breakdown of the survey results, but I provided some of them here to try to give you just a response. So we asked, are you concerned about hazards generally on the island? And the majority of responses were concerned about landslides and less so with the other. Still about half the respondents concerned about the proposed hazards and looking to ways to regulate those. We asked about the proposed development permit, and especially the triggers for development. And this is sort of common, about half the respondents were negative to the proposed development triggers, and some people were supportive, and some were maybe broadly supportive as a principle, but offered refinements and had critiques for some of the actual proposed triggers. Similarly, in terms of the mapping that we asked, so we provided a map of the proposed development permit areas. In this case, 2/3 of the people responding were negative about it, and 20% were positive. But then we sort of note in this that this is, and in other comments, I think generally the comments we got were not necessarily tied to the question that was asked in the survey, but people were generally dissatisfied with the proposal. So rather than necessarily specific to the questions, but we just, in general, the responses that were received were the majority were negative of the proposed development permit area. And so again, in this question 8, provide any feedback you have regarding the proposed process. 25 of the 35 responses were expressed lack of support for the project as presented. So in terms of the staff discussion of that, of the proposed development permit area, we note that a vocal majority of respondents are opposed to the project as presented, and even the members of the public who express support for the project, sometimes they had valuable feedback for staff to consider and to consider any proposed bylaw. So staff notice points to the need for additional action or refinement to the proposed mapping in the process and potentially more public engagement, as well as a review of how a new development permit area would impact staff time and processes. So based on that, and I've sort of touched on that, but based on that, the overall staff recommendation is to not proceed with the hazardous areas development permit area and instead proceed with the site alteration bylaw that I'll come to later. But and the alternatives as seen by staff is essentially taking more time to refine the proposal to come back, which would push sort of our project work plan timeline into a 2023 adoption timing, most likely, depending on how to proceed. But one of the things that staff really considered and heard from feedback from people is essentially what's the need for this hazardous area development permit area. If this doesn't proceed, what are gaps that are seen, or what are existing regulations that currently exist that cover some of the same ground? So the development permit area would have had 4 main areas of regulation. So I've sort of note some of these. So the stream flooding and erosion area, the majority of this proposed hazardous area would fall within the existing watershed aquifer streamside protection DPA, so it would be covered by a development permit. I note in the report that development permit has guidelines that are to ensure that development doesn't cause erosion, doesn't cause landslides. Because it makes sense. If you have a landslide next to a stream, it's going to impact the stream quality and the water quality, and it's sort of covered under that guideline. Staff traditionally we haven't had a major emphasis on requiring geotechnical reports as part of that development permit, and typically just seek the environmental report. And maybe that's something in light of the report we presented in July, that's something we need to cross consider, is that it's not enough to just say, cutting the trees won't impact the stream, but to ensure that it's not creating risk of erosion into the stream, which will impact the stream as well. The next one is the coastal erosion and flooding, and this probably got the majority of our negative comments. We're focused specifically on this area. So in the absence of the coastal erosion hazardous areas, building within 30 meters of the high water mark will continue to be in most zones on Bowen regulated by land use bylaw setbacks, which either have 30 meters or an average of the neighboring setbacks. And then based on the report provided and just more staff research, and there's more in the report as well, outlining sort of provincial best practices to account for coastal flooding and climate change in the future. I say here it's staff at the staff level would be requiring applicants to consider that in any variance requests for a reduction to setback to the sea, to say, okay, we may not have a development permit area for this, but it's something you need to consider, is that what's the risk of flooding in the future? And so staff would likely be asking applicants to provide that, and would be bringing that as a piece of an application for council's consideration. So then the third one, steep slopes and landslide risk. So this is, if it's not by a stream, but it's a steep slope, what regulations currently exist to regulate activities to prevent this? And I note, so either at the time of a building permit submission or and that should read subdivision application, staff have the ability to require geotechnical reports done. So if it's associated with a building, if it's associated with a subdivision. The other activities are the ones that remain unregulated at present. So that's be it sort of land clearing in preparation for a building permit application, if it's sort of the driveway building and the septic field installation and whatever else that takes place before the building permit is applied for, or that doesn't relate to just the building footprint itself. Is sort of the key gap that exists in our regulation. And to address that, staff have prepared the report outlining the site alteration bylaw to sort of fill that missing gap. So based on that, the staff recommendation is that committee of the whole recommend council direct staff to not proceed with the proposed hazardous areas development permit area. I'll stop at this point.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. So any comments out there? Personally, I'm glad you've gone down this road, Daniel. I think that's pretty wise. There was a lot of pushback, and I think there was some very there's some issues on the waterfront, no doubt, and you got a handful of that. But yeah, it was going to be a lot of work to get that through, and I think it is covered, like you said, in the different aspects. So that's a good thing. So I'm going to go to Sue Ellen first, and then David.
I think David had his hand up first.
Okay, I'm just looking on my screen here. That's all I see. Sorry, David, go ahead.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, I mean, generally, Daniel, I support the approach you're taking for the same reasons that Gary said. Like, there's obviously more time needed here. But one simple question, and I think you've covered it, but I'm not sure. So, suppose we get, another big storm, big atmospheric river, and we end up with landslides of some sort that create damage or home issues. Would there be any legal issues that we'd have to face because we did not take preparatory action?
I think generally it's like the liability comes in, when I might have to think about that. Like, I guess it would be when development is approved that doesn't. So like if we created
the problem,
created like subdivision lots, and we didn't do the due diligence in requiring that it be free from hazard, as opposed to the fact that it's, if it's a lot that's created that we don't regulate land clearing and somebody does land clearing, when we don't have bylaws in place and then a hazard is created. I don't know that there's liability, but I might have to think about that some more.
Sure. Okay. Thanks. I mean, you don't need to answer it right now. It's something. I mean, I know this has happened in other communities, and we're going to presumably get more of these kinds of storm situations that could lead to things happening that we never expected to happen. So it's just something that should be looked at. That's all. Thanks. That's it.
Thanks, David. Sue Ellen.
Thank you. I appreciate the report. I'm sorry to see the recommendation because today was although I understand, and I know we've got the site alteration bylaw coming up as well in this committee of the whole. I'm concerned because today one of the big international intergovernmental reports on climate change came out, and it says that everything is getting worse faster than we thought, and it's this year with the heat wave and the fires and the flooding event and the on Bowen here the heat, of course, and the fire danger and the droughts and all these things, they all add up to instability and vulnerability and some hazards. And I, the day that the report comes out, here we are thinking about limiting this hazardous areas development permit area to help us grow as a less vulnerable island. So I'm, I guess I'm interested in going with the I'm thinking about a couple things that weren't mentioned. One of them is that a couple of our public beaches have been undermined by the king tides and the that happened with the sea level rise. So Alder Cove and Tunstall Bay Beach, if you go down there, you'll see that they're quite changed. I think we do have a hazards and vulnerability assessment report that includes things like rock fall. So I don't know if that would be captured by the creek kind of side of things, but it might be captured by the other reports that you might ask for as staff. I'm encouraged by the fact that you're going, well, we're going to ask for that. Oh gosh, what's it called? The flood level 1, FCL something?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that you may ask for other permits. So, but just faced with climate change and being, having been on the emergency committee since we set it, I think the emergency and committee's part of its response is setting us up to protect the community. I think I'm more interested myself in alternative number 2. This is on page 5 of 6, that the committee of the whole recommend council direct staff to amend. Anyway, I won't make the motion now, but I just wanted to let you know that's limiting the scope, because I also understand that we've got tons of work on staff at the moment, and that might remove some of the objections too that we've heard from the public, and we because my feeling is I think that there are lots of people who don't aren't as familiar with the idea of climate change coming, and so the hazard that might come with it. So in general, I'm not sure how I'm going to vote there, but I'm more interested in alternative number 2. And I'd be a lot more comfortable had we had the site alteration bylaw on the agenda first. That's me over.
Okay, thanks, Sue Ellen. Yeah, to your point, I was talking to the building inspector the other day, and he was saying he's still going to use the information from the hazardous slopes from the mapping. And if he gets a project that's in there, he'll look at the map and he'll say, oh, okay, so the hazardous slopes, like there might be an issue here. I'll take a look at it and determine whether they're going to need a geotech or not. So it's not going to go away. It's just coming out in a different form, I think, more than anything. Allison?
Yeah, I guess I was a little confused by David's question, because to me, there's a big difference between something that's already built and something that is going to be built. And I think the site alteration bylaw can pick up all the going to be stuff. And that's where we've got to do our due diligence. If the Allens Trust and the GVRD didn't do the right due diligence when a house was built, well, I'm not quite sure what we would do with that. I'm thinking, you know, if you're thinking of those ones up in Sechelt, for example, or a couple of ones in North Van that slid down the bank. And I guess the other is I'm fully supportive of the approach that the staff is recommending, that we not go ahead with the hazardous slopes, because I think most of it will be done, and the damage that's been done to the beaches with the high tides would not have been prevented by having a hazardous slopes development permit area. Because again, we're talking about future work, and I think what we were wanting to try and do was prevent somebody going in and clear cutting a lot or doing a lot of blasting and stuff without any permits and without any consideration of anything, and which the site alteration bylaw, if I'm understanding correctly, would pick up. So I'm quite happy with shelving the hazardous slopes bylaw and going ahead with the site alteration one.
Yeah, there would be very few places on the waterfront that wouldn't be protected by the 30-meter setback. I mean, obviously Snug Cove and a few other areas might be vulnerable, but most of it, even at that 16-foot level, which I think is a little bit high, the 5-meter level, but there certainly is protection there as far as the 30-meter setback. Michael,
I had one more question.
okay, go ahead also.
Daniel, some people have been saying that you'd measure a certain height in from just what is current high tide or high water mark. So can you just clarify if somebody in the 30-foot setback was asked to consider just where the measurement would start from?
Sure. I mean, it is confusing because it's a different measurement than our high water mark and our setback from that, in that the flood control level or the flood construction reference plane starts from the mean sea level.
Oh,
so it is a confusing thing. At the high water mark measures where, essentially you can think of it where the ocean generally goes up to, right? It has a line, no vegetation stops, and this is generally where the ocean goes up to. And that the flood control level or the flood is essentially trying to measure how high does the water come in a storm. So it says this is the mean sea level, this is a high tide level, gets measured on top, and then if there's a storm surge, on top of that, and then future sea level rise gets measured on top of that, and you say, okay, in a storm, this is how high the water could reach. So that's why we end up with these different levels. So one is, this is how high the water normally reaches, and this is how high it reaches, could reach in a bad storm. But so it's not measured, it's not from the high water mark and 5 meters up, but it's from the mean sea level and 5 meters up above that.
Oh, that's much better.
5 meters straight up, not 5 meters limp low.
5 meters straight up, and then you measure where that reaches the land. So if you think about it, if it's if the sea level is a high bank and a cliff, well, 5 meters is still hitting the cliff. If you're in a low lying area, 5 meters can go much further back.
Thank you.
All right, Michael. Thank you. Allison.
Thank you, Mayor. Daniel, thank you for a very nuanced and balanced report. I actually feel that any small limitations can in fact be covered off by the rest of our discussions this afternoon. And to the mayor's point, dealing with the building inspector, I think that kind of says a great deal. In terms of liability, we will be very careful that we do follow such procedures are necessary to ensure that we've acted in such a manner that whilst we cannot be responsible for everything in the world, we will take all reasonable care and due diligence. I'm very much in favor of the recommendation as presented, and I would be happy to read that recommendation if it met with council's approval to do so.
Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, the recommendation is that the Committee of the Whole recommend council direct staff a site alteration bylaw to present at a regular council meeting and recommend council.
Sorry, Councillor
Hang on.
Kale, we're on the
Sorry,
wrong recommendation.
I beg your pardon. There we go. The recommendation that the Committee of the Whole recommend council direct staff to not proceed with the proposed hazardous areas development permit area. And I'd like to make that recommendation.
Thank you, Michael.
Apologies for the other recommendation.
No worries. We'll get there. Don't you worry. Okay. Any further discussion on this? I just, I don't see anybody. Just for clarification, and I somehow missed this totally, Daniel, but what you're saying is that 5 meter vertical is from a half tide, because we got a 16-foot tide, so it's at an 8-foot level. So the mean from the high tide would only be 8 feet then. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know the specifics, but it's the mean sea level. So it's not the high tide mark, but it's the mean sea level.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, and that's not just half of the sea level rise.
It's figure 1 in the report, Gary, on page 3.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Okay,
so
didn't check that.
you've got high tide.
Okay, I'll get that. Okay, since there's no other stupid questions, I'll ask you a question. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And opposed? Sue Ellen.
Yeah, I'm opposed.
Okay, and Councillor Fast in opposition. Okay, thank you, everybody, for that. We'll move on to 3B, which is the proposed site alteration bylaw. Back to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so site alteration bylaw, and this is just overview. So the power for a site alteration bylaw is different than a development permit area, in that the power comes from the community charter, which has the fundamental powers it lists for a municipality. And so one of those is council may by bylaw regulate, prohibit, and impose requirements in relation to the removal of soil and the deposit of soil or other material. So it's a fairly broad power that's given in the community charter. And so the report, I know this isn't very readable, but it's just for sort of background. The report has an overview of some example site alteration bylaws, and just to show more that there's sort of a broad range of how people regulate this and what people require and what triggers the need for a bylaw, and yeah, what's required as part of a permit application. So in the summer, or I guess in this fall, BIM staff received an update report from our scholar who identified best practice associated with site alteration bylaw. So he outlines site alteration bylaws may be used to regulate practices that may otherwise present safety concerns, may reduce ecosystem health or be a nuisance to the community. And then the report notes that I've noted the scope of site alteration bylaws do range quite widely. But his report recommended that it consider 4 practices: so grade alteration, soil removal, soil compaction, vegetation removal, and rock blasting. And then in terms of just staff discussion for the content of a bylaw that staff would be drafting, is that our aim for a bylaw would be that it would permit would be required for large scale projects such as subdivisions, large driveway construction, significant grade alteration, but trying to craft it so that it's not capturing small scale work such as landscaping and garden creation. So the report that we received notes that small scale, low risk modifications can be made without consulting a QEP, but communities, there's not like a hard science in terms of what's a small scale, low risk activity, and communities tend to determine what's, small scale and low risk, and that varies by community. So the report recommends an amount of soil removal of 10 cubic meters as triggering the need for a site alteration permit. And looking at it, that seems reasonable, or some places have a higher threshold, such as the Squamish bylaw has a 30 cubic meter threshold, but it varies. So it would be 10 meters in a highly sloped area. And, maybe that's more appropriate for the Bowen situation. The next area to consider in a bylaw would be tree removal. So some bylaws regulate tree removal on its own, and sometimes it's at the overall effect. And so staff would seek direction from council on this point, but as envisioned at this point, staff would tailor a bylaw that regulates vegetation removal as it relates to grade alteration or the creation of an area of exposed soil. So it's not the removal of a tree by itself that would trigger it, but it's if you are exposing soil over a certain area, be it a % of the lot or a size area, that's now triggering erosion risk. And so it triggers soil removal risk as a result of that, and that's what would be regulated. Other thing to consider is what's required as part of a permit application. So some seem universal, so a site plan and property information. But the bigger question is, what triggers the need for professional reports, such as a geotechnical or a environmental report as part of the application, and trying to determine where that threshold is. So, we noted sort of in our review, some bylaws of Squamish's bylaw require reports if required by the general manager, or something that provides some degree of flexibility in terms of staff evaluating permits. There's some discussion what would be an appropriate fee. And then finally, it's figuring out how a site alteration bylaw would fit with existing permits. And so trying to avoid, as much as possible, I think, adding another permit to the system, but finding ways that, okay, this can cover an existing permit. So potentially instead of getting a site alteration permit and then an excavation permit and then a building permit, that it would just be a site alteration permit and then a building permit, or but figuring some way to sort of reduce overload of permits through this process. So the staff recommendation is that the committee of the whole recommend council direct staff draft a site alteration bylaw to present at a regular council meeting, and recommend council direct staff to prepare engagement materials associated with the site alteration bylaw for a public engagement session. So with that recommendation, staff anticipate then bringing a draft bylaw to council for then that draft bylaw to be referred to committees and an open house before coming back to council for readings. But in directing staff to prepare that material at the start, then we would bring it all to council and say, this is the draft and this is how we would go out to engagement and save sort of more back and forth.
All right, well, thank you, Dan. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That sounds really good. I think what we're trying to avoid is wholesale lot blasting and leveling, and trying to work with the actual, the ground as it is, and maybe do a little bit of blasting and that sort of thing. But I think we got to get away from this wholesale land clearing and flattening, as it were. Anyway, sorry, Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, Daniel, and I'm sort of on Gary's point on the wholesale land clearing, which we sometimes see. What are you thinking around tree removal? Are you thinking numbers? Are you thinking space, like an area, or what are your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, so my initial thoughts, in looking at it, is that it be tailored so it's not a tree removal bylaw, but what it is regulating exposing soils. So it's, the clear one is, okay, if you're altering grade, you're removing the vegetation to do it, that would trigger at a certain size. Or it's that, well, if what you're doing is your land clearing, again, if you're doing over a certain percent of the lot, or you're doing over a certain area, that triggers a permit as well, because now you're increasing the risk of erosion and whatever that brings with it. Rather than, you see somewhere they say, well, you can remove 2 trees a year and you don't need a permit, or 3, but more this is about specifically the site alteration and the soil removal rather than tree removal.
Okay.
And that's not to say, Rob, that there's anything like council has the power in that same community charter section. There's one that's specifically about tree removal. So council fully has the authority and the ability to have a tree removal bylaw, and some communities do. And that's a sort of community conversation about tree removal. But the way this project is envisioned by staff at this point is that we're not regulating tree removal, but we are regulating, exposing soil and altering grade.
All right, thanks, Rob. Maureen?
Rob, were you finished?
Yeah, I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for the report. And you clarified a number of points that I had some concerns about, that this is not intended, for example, to regulate the creation of gardens or the landscaping on a property. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct. That's the intent. And then it always gets hard when trying to then write it in a bylaw.
Yeah.
What the actual numbers are. Somebody may say, well, making my garden, I would need a permit, and you're not intending to do that. And it says, well, maybe that's a bigger scale than we envisioned.
Yeah. It's I can see the challenges there. The clarification around the tree removal. I just remember in 2011 when there was a prior attempt at putting in a bylaw that dealt with tree removal, that the response of many community members was to go out and take down as many trees as they could before the bylaw came into place. And I have to confess, we did that on our property because we were anticipating doing a number of things on that property in the coming decade, and did not want to be constrained. So that the recommendations that came from the scholar regarding limiting to 4 trees over a 5-year period seemed to me to be frankly silly in a rural context. In a 5-year period, we would probably have had 20 new trees that were popping up, and to be that restrictive. So I really am glad that you did not go in that direction. You and the other thing that I'm glad you didn't pick up on was in the report from the scholar, the notion that significant trees would be identified by municipal council, and it just did not make sense to me that municipal council was going to identify significant trees on particular lots. And then finally, there's a mention of the increased workload for bylaw and presumably for planning staff. Could you say a little bit more about what's anticipated there? If this were to come.
Yeah, so I guess the one side is, well, it's now, you know, to some extent regulating and permitting things that we haven't in the past. So it's another level of review, another level of permitting. And then another level of, I think for bylaw, you know, potential bylaw infractions. I mean, so I think as it is, and Bonnie I can see is there and she may have other thoughts, but in terms of bylaw stuff, one of their key like calls they get from people is land clearing activities on, you know, neighboring lots. And this would add to this, because at this point, sometimes people call in, you know, to say my neighbor's clearing all their trees and bylaw to come look. Well, bylaw may say, well, they're not in a development permit area. You know, it's not something we actually regulate. They're allowed to cut the trees down on their lot. But now in this case, it may be that, okay, well, no, it is bylaw work because it is a bylaw infraction.
So in your report, you mentioned that there might be 20 complaints to bylaw related to this potential bylaw. How many of those 20 complaints, and this may be difficult to answer, but are we talking about 20 complaints about 2 instances of land clearing? Or are we talking about 20 complaints over 20 instances of land clearing? So for example, I could see that there might be quite a few complaints related to the work that was being done on Rivendell or at Grafton.
Sorry, Maureen, the report is that about 20% of complaints.
20% of complaints.
So about, you know, like 1 in 5 of bylaw complaints about land use bylaw stuff are about you know, land clearing.
Okay, sorry that I
Alteration.
got that wrong, but my question still stands. I mean, are they related to a couple of significant instances of land clearing, or are they 20% and all dealing with separate complaints?
I would say all dealing with separate. In general, I think on Bowen, if you run a chainsaw and you cut down more than 2 trees, probably somebody calls the bylaw department. That's
Yeah, I would concur, Daniel, although big visible sites like Rivendell and such, we might get a few calls, but there are a lot of individual calls from individual properties that make up that 20% as well. So it's hard to give you exact numbers. I'd have to go through with a fine-tooth comb with our stats, but I would say generally there are a lot of complaints for small scale or neighborly type concerns.
And how do you handle those at present?
We have to we respond. We go out and we do site visits and see if there's any infractions, like if the clearing is being done in a watershed aquifer stream protection area, then we follow up accordingly. But if not, then, you know, it's legal, right? There's legal alterations that are going on currently. Yeah, so we just have to do site visit and then follow up according to other regulations, provincial and other bylaws that we do have.
And there's often a lot of back and forth with the individual between staff, and occasionally I get involved in it too, because they then decide to go direct to me or something.
Okay, just one final point then, which is that in setting aside, at least temporarily, the hazardous bylaw, there were a number of arguments made about this is being dealt with through existing regulations, or largely dealt with through existing regulations. So what I'm struggling with a bit is the necessity for this bylaw on an island-wide basis if what we're dealing with are a number of cases and that could be largely dealt with through existing bylaws. And I don't know if that's the case. And I'm hearing that maybe it isn't, but that's what I want to be more certain about before supporting a bylaw that is going to affect all properties on this island. So I'll end there.
Okay, thanks, Sue Ellen. I'm gonna go to David, then Allison, and then Sue Ellen.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for this, Daniel. I'm just pondering what Maureen just said a little bit, but yeah. I think this is important. I like the way you're approaching it. I like that you're making it clear that this isn't for small little things. Getting to what Maureen just said, like I don't want to add unnecessary complexities and costs to what's already an increasingly expensive process to try to build a house. So I support your flexibility, but I don't envy you in trying to figure out how to word a regulation that has that in, like the one from Squamish about you don't need a qualified environmental professional unless it's required by the general manager. So I mean, where do you draw a line? How on earth do you figure that out so that people can understand it? So I don't know, maybe you can help us on that. But just one more thing. So then in your report, I looked at the draft bylaw that's sort of a little bit further down. Are you looking at that as an example? Do you want reactions to that? Because I liked some of it and I didn't like some of it. I thought some of it was too narrow, too restrictive, and other parts were about right. Do you want us to be looking at that, or is that okay? That was not something that you need a specific response to?
I don't need a specific response. That's like a sample blasting bylaw.
Well, there was a blasting one, and then there was one before that, just above it, just above the blasting.
3.3 of the Turley's report.
It's on page. I've got it right here.
26.
10 of 18.
Right.
Yeah, 10 of 18.
I don't think I need feedback. Like that was what was provided in the report. And I think some of it already I've said, well, I don't necessarily agree with it. So like the tree removal piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, the very first one, number one, alteration of existing grade over 1 meter at any point. Well, our land is so bumpy. 1 meter. I mean, hard to imagine a lot that you wouldn't have to deal with a meter.
Yeah, so I wasn't going to use that as a basis to start drafting.
In that case, I'm fine. Thank you very much. But yeah, I like the idea of being flexible, but I don't know how you're going to do it in a way that. But I'll leave that to you. Thanks.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Okay, I think it was Allison and then Sue Ellen.
Okay, so picking up on David's question, I had some specific questions. There's reference in here to a blasting bylaw. So part of the issue with blasting is the noise and it going, or we get into rock removal where people put the pick on the end of the back of the digger's fork and pick away at it for days on end.
Yeah.
So is that picked up at all? Is that picked up in one of these things? I know we tried to do a noise bylaw to cover that off a few years back, and it somehow got strenuous objection for 1 or 2 people on council, so it didn't go anywhere. So is that kind of thing picked up?
I don't think I would be necessarily.
Okay, so because part of the objection that people have to these things is not what's happening, but the noise it's creating and the fact that the duration. So I'm just throwing that one out. The other is with vegetation removal, tree removal, or whatever, we've got to remember fire smart principles and not stop somebody from removing a tree that is a hazard tree from the perspective of, being a fire smart community. So, I don't know how you can work that into the bylaw. Maybe some vegetation removals recommended by a local fire smart representative for the purposes of fire smarting. I mean, if that's an exemption, because you've got that zone area. The other, I guess, is just when I read it, soil compaction to me did not have anything to do with impervious surfaces. So if you're going to have headings, I think you need both of them. I wouldn't have put two of them together. And then when you talk about tree removal, is that just cutting down the tree or is that pulling the roots? Because if you cut the tree down but don't pull the roots, then you have an exposed vegetation. So it's I'm not sure. And then I guess.
I was gonna say, I mean, the issue becomes is like if you cut the trees and leave the roots, the slope is maintained until the roots rot and then it's exposed.
Yeah, okay. And then I guess the other question is, so much during a period of time, given the size of the lots, how are you going to be able to measure the period of time? I mean, somebody does something in year one and 3 years later they sell the property and somebody else proceeds and has no knowledge of what went on before. So
I mean, I agree, Allison. I think like that's what was in the scholars report, and that's not the approach I think that I would take. And instead, I would say it's just an area.
Okay, and yeah, so you don't really want us to comment on that bylaw particularly. So yeah, and the blasting bylaw had allowing it in daylight hours. Well, daylight's at 5:30 in the morning, so I'm not sure you want to do that. And significant tree, you're not going that route, so I don't need to ask you what you mean by significant tree. And then the only other question, which sort of I always raise, is permit if required by the general manager. General managers change. And I mean, I guess there's consistency of approach. So I don't know whether you would then need a policy to go along with the bylaw for that kind of thing.
I think if that was the case, I think we would, or at the very least, would be like permit, application documents, and it would be telling people these are the guide, like this is actually when we're going to require it.
Okay, and then I guess the other was just 10 cubic meters of soil on a city-sized lot or a half-acre, quarter-acre lot versus 10 cubic meters of soil on a 10-acre lot. So I don't know whether there's a lot size relevance.
Yeah, that's true.
Plus steepness and flatness. But okay, I'll give up. I'll be quiet.
Rough traders. Thank you, Allison.
I'm in favor of going ahead with drafting a bylaw, though.
Okay, yes. Got a long way to go on this. Sue Ellen?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm in support of the staff recommendation here. No surprise, I expect. I had a question. Well, I'll just say a couple things. I've had people talk to me about the need for a blasting bylaw, as in people in neighborhoods where their foundation wall has cracked after blasting nearby that they didn't even know was going to happen. Excuse me. And there was nothing to stop it. And they recommended the West Vancouver blasting bylaw when they'd gone to look. So just in case that's helpful. I think the noise point is a really good one. I'm appreciating the discussion here. I'm remembering years ago, out past September, above September Morn Beach. Anyway, that whole slope up there, there were machines driving along, bulldozing, and cleared the whole slope. And this was one of those examples, Gary, of your wholesale flattening and clearing. And the noise was went on for at least one full summer, if not several. Anyway, that's just an example. And there's probably lots of other ones, including ones that I hear in the middle of Crippen Park often. And so I'm in general, I like the erosion, the soil, that point of view about the grade. I'll bring up my climate change thing again, but my question about bylaw relates to if these complaints are coming in, 20% of them, I think that's significant, and it tells us a little bit about the community interest and concern. And I also think if bylaw is visiting these sites anyway, then perhaps it won't be that much of a extra burden if they actually had a tool that they could use. So for these various reasons, I'm in favor. But my question is, what would the impact on staff be if there's any kind of estimate to what that might be? Because I also think there's the downsides of it, like what happens when bad things happen. Anyway, Bonnie, if you're there, or Daniel, if you know.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it in terms of like the permitting side of it and staff requirements, and I don't know if I have a definite answer until I can know, what's actually in the bylaw, and so we can figure out, okay, how much activity would actually need a separate permit versus would be covered, would be okay, instead of an excavation permit, you're getting a site alteration permit, and we're wanting more things in it, but in essence, we're just,
replace
you're
it.
getting a more comprehensive permit instead of but it's still just one permit.
Yeah, and I think as far as bylaw service officers' time, I don't see a huge increase. I mean, because they're already responding to the complaint, and sometimes if there's a process, a policy, a bylaw to point to, it actually sort of shortens the duration of the complaint somewhat sometimes.
Thank you. Over.
All right, anybody else? Thank you, Sue Ellen. Yeah, I certainly like the idea of putting a site bylaw instead of an excavation bylaw and combining it all, and basically putting it in there and saying you cannot touch the site until you have some kind of bylaw. But I don't know how you get to the ongoing, the ones that all, people might have, say they got 5 or 10 acres or something, and then they go out to clear a bunch of land. How do you get to them that they have to get? That's going to be the tricky part, is how do you get to them and say, hey, you know what? That's going to be the interesting part. It's because people just expect that they've got a big piece of property, they can do whatever they want on it. So it's going to be an interesting communication piece. Anyway, the recommendation is.
I see Michael's got his hand up, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, Michael, go ahead.
Gary, I wonder, second time lucky, if I this time could read the recommendation correctly.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Yeah. The recommendation being that the Committee of the Whole recommend Council direct staff draft a site alteration bylaw to present at a regular council meeting, and recommend Council direct staff to prepare engagement materials associated with the site alteration bylaw for a public engagement session.
Second.
Okay, great.
I've got a question about timing.
Okay.
And whether it should be brought back to a committee of the whole rather than a council meeting.
What would be your thought on that, Daniel?
I don't know if I have a strong opinion. I'd said a council meeting to bring it for, to introduce the bylaw and for referrals, and we typically do that at a regular, as opposed to a committee of the whole. But
I guess
open
I'm
to
thinking
either.
with the council meeting, you don't really have necessarily the time or freedom to answer it, and because it's the first time we've done something like this.
Well, I guess, go ahead, Maureen.
I would be more comfortable with coming back to a committee of the whole. I have concerns about this bylaw. I'd like to have a chance to open it, open the discussion.
Okay.
I don't want to vote against the resolution on the table. I'd like
Yeah,
to.
and I guess my second question then is, from timing perspective, if we're going to do a committee of the whole, then the recommendation to direct staff to prepare engagement materials would come at the committee of the whole. So I seems to me we should sever the resolution and not deal with the second recommend and change regular council meeting to committee of the whole.
Well,
Because
We could always take it to a regular council meeting, and then if we find it's too intricate, take it out to a committee of the whole. I mean, we
I
could
think
always-
you're gonna find it's too intricate. I'd rather do committee of the whole right off the bat.
No, Sue Ellen?
I'm in favor of the motion as is moved and seconded in front of us, partly because I want to move this ahead so that we can complete it within this term. Partly because it's been in the works for so long. And even back when I seem to recall that there was a soil and removal and deposition bylaw back when we were Islands Trust before we became a municipality. Anyway, I think it's high. This will be really valuable to the community, and I think as Gary says, we can always even within a council meeting, you could go into a committee of the whole, and I don't want to slow it down, and I think we should have give staff some clear direction by supporting it as per the staff recommendation that's in front of us. Thank you.
Okay, Daniel, do you, are you happy bringing it back as to the regular council meeting?
Is there an amendment being made? I haven't heard.
I'm
any-
about to make an amendment if
Well, let's just see.
David's put his hand up, so I wondered what he was.
I was just going to ask,
David?
I'm sympathetic to Maureen and Allison's position, but I'm also agree with Sue Ellen. I'd like to have that completed this term. So my question goes back to staff.
Yeah,
Okay, if we bring it to committee of the whole first, can we still do it this term?
I don't think that committee of the whole or council would have a major impact other than just the need to schedule the committee of the whole, and as opposed to, regular council that happens already. Bringing the draft bylaw, we wouldn't be seeking readings, so the committee of the whole could consider it and could, at that point, recommend council do the referrals, provided you're happy with the, the draft bylaw that we bring. I would be seeking referrals before doing any readings of the bylaw. And then the other piece, as a regulatory bylaw that's not a land use bylaw, it is a faster bylaw process, and that it doesn't require the public hearing or the Islands Trust referral necessarily.
Okay.
Okay.
Adding the committee of the whole may just add a week or two, because
Thank
it would
you.
go from the committee of the whole back to council to direct staff to do the next thing.
Thank
But
you.
at the
I
same time,
thought
we
it
go
would
to-
take longer.
Though, eh?
Yeah.
At the same
So-
time, can we take it from the committee of the whole to agencies, or does it have to come back to council?
Council committee of the whole generally
That's-
doesn't direct staff, but
Okay.
but we could do it. We could sequence it like this, where it's a committee of the whole on the same day that there's a regular council meeting, and it's just
Okay.
No, there's a good answer. Okay, so if we're gonna split this up, Allison, have you got anything further?
Well, I would move an amendment that we, well, first of all, I'm going to ask that it be severed,
Yeah,
just so we can discuss the two, because I really have concerns about staff spending the time to prepare engagement materials before we've had the committee of the whole meeting. And because the whole thing, it could change. And don't we normally do referrals to staff or to committees before we do public engagement? Or do we do them simultaneously?
Normally, I get the referral to do them all together.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So so timing wise, Daniel, that was the other question I asked. When do you anticipate you might be coming back with this? Because all we're doing is asking you to bring it back to a meeting, and you could bring it back to a meeting next October. Do we
I
want?
think I'm going to have to look at my department work plan, but if the direction to not proceed with the hazardous areas, and instead it saves us to switch focus to this bylaw, but it wouldn't be in March and it might be in April. I guess is what I would say.
Oh, that's fine. That
Yeah.
should be good.
But I guess to give the public some idea of timing, could we put in my motion to amend to, I would say, to a committee of the whole by April, the end of April? Would that be fair?
Yeah.
That wasn't a real, that wasn't a real pause.
Okay, so if we don't have to do a public hearing, how long would it take from the time we had the committee of the whole?
I would have to draw it out, but I would imagine if it's an April committee of the whole, it's doing referrals in May and coming back in June then for bylaw readings.
And so we could have it all done by the end of July.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're into September. So if we want to
Yeah.
aim for that, then, okay, I'm going to move that the motion be amended by deleting regular council meeting and insert present at a committee of the whole meeting before the end of April.
Okay, and now you're gonna do the rest of it too, or not?
Well, I've asked that it be severed, so
Well,
that
then I
just
think
automatically happens.
then I think we'll have to cancel. I don't think that's a friendly amendment, is it?
I just,
Can it be severed as generally an amendment?
Yeah, we need it to be moved before it can be a motion on the table.
Well, it's moved. and
Seconded.
Sue
Yeah.
Ellen moved it, and I thought somebody seconded
It
it.
was
Sorry, I
second.
didn't move anything.
Oh, I
No.
thought
You need somebody to move your amendment, Councillor Morris,
I'm moving my amendment.
and somebody to second it.
I need somebody, so I was hoping that Councillor Nicholson would second it.
I'm sure
she
she
was
will.
wanting-
Yeah, thank you, Maureen.
But my amendment has nothing to do with severing. That's just an automatic, right? Because there's two recommendations in there,
Okay,
correct? So I'm just dealing with the first one, but the committee,
Okay.
the whole.
The recommendation is written as one.
Okay, and I've asked that it be severed into two, and that doesn't need a motion.
That's part of your amendment. Yeah.
No, just severed.
You're
Yeah.
asking for it to be severed and for council
To-
meeting to be changed to committee of the whole and adding in the words
Yeah.
before the end of April. So that's
Yeah.
your amendment.
But I
Okay.
didn't,
so Maureen has seconded that. And then I guess any further discussion? And I'll ask a question. Now, is everybody clear what's happening here?
First sentence
Okay.
only, yeah.
Okay, that's great. And then I will ask a question, all in favor? Aye.
Yeah.
And opposed. Rob, did you get an aye in there?
oh, you ran away.
Thank you. And opposed? Nobody. Okay, fine. Well, that was interesting. Okay, so that brings this meeting to a close. Thank
No,
you.
no, hang on. The second part,
Oh, the other part, well, no, I thought we,
Yep. So there's the other motion remaining
okay, yeah, I thought we were
That-
done.
that the committee of the
Okay,
whole
so-
directs staff to prepare engagement materials associated with the site alteration bylaw for a public engagement session.
Okay, I'll move that. Second, Allison.
Well, no, my concern with that is timing. If we totally don't like what comes to the committee of the whole, then Daniel spent a lot of time preparing engagement materials, which are not of any use.
Oh,
So can we say, if you could throw in the words appropriate time or something, so he could be thinking about them, but not actually preparing them.
why do we even have to put that in at all? It's done as a matter of course, isn't it?
Maureen has.
Are we trying to save time here? I mean, you would normally do that anyway, wouldn't you, Daniel?
Yeah.
This,
Typically, I would do it after the council meeting, after I get direction to hold a public open house.
Yeah.
So this was me saying, okay, maybe I'll start to prepare it in advance of getting that direction from council for a public open house. To try to cut down the time between,
Timeline.
if I came in April, trying to be able to schedule an open house more quickly after that council meeting.
my sense is that Daniel, you'd be thinking about it all the way along, and this is also really just getting council's express direction that there will be a public house or a public engagement with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So could we change the motion to read, recommend that council direct staff to plan for a public engagement associated with the site alteration bylaw? And that leaves the
Sure,
timing
that-
a little
that
up
works
in
for
the
me.
air.
Yeah.
Did you get that, Hope?
Yep.
Okay, I don't see that this is a
so
really,
is that's another amendment. Do you have a seconder?
Sure, I'll second that.
Thanks, David. Okay, so Maureen, have you got your hand up still?
Yeah, I actually do find it helpful when we're considering a bylaw to at the same time be aware of
Right.
the public facing material that's in the work. So this speaks to Liam's point. And I think it also would be helpful for the public to see what is being proposed, but in more lay language than you would see in a bylaw. So I do understand why Daniel was proposing that they go forward hand in hand. So I think it actually does go beyond just planning for public engagement.
Okay, that's good point. Sue Ellen, and then we'll.
Yeah. Well, first is a point of order, I think, because we did have, when the original motion that was moved and seconded, Michael Kale, David Hawken, was severed. The second part should read that the committee of the whole recommend that council direct staff to prepare engagement materials associated with the site alteration bylaw for public engagement session. That's what I would like to vote on because it was moved and seconded. Secondly, that's what I'm in favor of. I agree with what Councillor Nicholson has just said about the helping the public to participate and understand what's being proposed. And then it's also like a draft in that it's so much farther ahead. When the changes are made, everybody can understand that this, I don't want it to slow the process down. And I worry that by just saying plan, we're actually potentially slowing the process. So I would like to vote on the motion that was on the floor.
Which was to prepare the engagement materials.
That's correct. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I'd
Okay,
like to
well, let's.
call the question.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm really now getting quite confused because I've never seen draft public engagement post materials presented to a council meeting or a committee of the whole. I've seen Daniel's PowerPoint presentations, which is why I wanted a committee of the whole, so we could be discussing it in layman's language and actually talking about what the words mean. So I just don't want him thinking he's got to have all the poster boards and everything ready to go for the public, for the council, for the committee of the whole meeting. So
I don't think so.
If I could just comment on that, the short-term rental work came forward to council with public engagement materials developed to, in part, help us understand what was being proposed by staff.
okay, well, I
And
just took
decide
those
one.
for us, not for public, and they would then become public engagement. So if that's what you're wanting, things that are just PowerPoint, but not having prepared paid for the boards and all that sort of stuff, I'm happy. And I thought I moved an amendment that David had seconded, but maybe I didn't.
Okay, so we're on the second part of this severed thing, and it's now recommended the council direct staff to prepare engagement materials associated with the site alteration bylaw for the public engagement session. Now, I'm going to move that again, and Hope, I don't think there was a second on that yet.
Yeah, we've got David.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay. And I'll ask the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, we're good. Thank you. Wow. Okay, so that on that happy note, we'll call this meeting adjourned, and we'll all reconvene at 6:15.
What time is it now?
5:17.
Oh, we got time to have dinner.